Good evening, and thank you for coming back to join us. We are proud to present Ken Hoy with Rubrik. Please help me give him a warm welcome.
Okay, good? Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today in the midst of this really big happy hour. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about how Rubrik is able to help you as an end user manage, protect your data effectively in a hybrid cloud world. So my name is Kenneth Hoy. I am a technical marketing engineer with Rubrik. Have been in the data protection, data management industry for 2 decades and been working specifically around AWS for the past 5 years. So just a quick walk through the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the hybrid cloud journey, what we're seeing today with customers who are looking to move from on-prem to AWS in some form. Then we're going to talk about how Rubrik helps, an example of how Rubrik helped one customer in their cloud journey, and then talk about specifically the technology behind how it enables customers to use AWS and more effectively to protect the hybrid cloud environment. So let's start by talking a bit about the hybrid cloud world. So obviously there was a time where people thought we were going to move 100% to the cloud, and that was going to be done within a 5-year period. But obviously that is not the case. As we talk with customers today, most of them are either some amount of workloads that will never actually move to the public cloud, or it's going to take up some amount of refactoring. It may take years and years. And in some cases, maybe they can move them in a few months. But the point is that we have customers on many parts of that journey around the public cloud, and they know that for the foreseeable future, they will have to run some workloads on premises, as well as some workloads in the cloud itself. And that's borne out in this report by RightScale, where 70% of respondents said they will be using a hybrid cloud environment, a mix of both public and private cloud infrastructure. So and that maps really well to actually what we see as we talk with customers today, that there is really like a 3-stage journey for folks who are moving to the cloud. The overwhelming majority of the customers we talk to today are looking at things like S3, for example, as a way to save costs by moving off of tape and moving their backup data into the public cloud. And then as some of those customers get more comfortable with using services like S3 or elastic block storage, they start thinking about how do we actually migrate workloads to the cloud and start running in an AWS environment. And they want to know what's the best way to migrate there, what's the best way to start instantiating workloads, and do that in a flexible and cost-effective manner. And then a smaller group of people who are much further along the journey, they start talking about how do we not just migrate workloads, but how do we actually run net new applications in the public cloud, and how do we build it to be highly resilient, using multiple regions, using even in some cases even multiple cloud vendors. So here's a typical customer. I'm going to call him Acme. So Acme is a customer is an example of a customer you see every day who has a large on-premises estate. That could be made up of bare metal Windows machines, bare metal Linux, could be VMware, could be Hyper-V, but they are starting to look into the public cloud to use AWS, for example, as a DR environment or as a test dev environment, and they want to start figuring out how to move from their current state to a future state where some or even all of their workloads are actually running in AWS, where they're leveraging all the services that makes them more flexible and more cost-effective. So if you're Acme, there are 3 things you're thinking about, right? It's if I'm going to use the cloud, how can I use the cloud today to lower the cost of storage? Because SANs and saving things on tape libraries and moving tape off to off-site is an expensive proposition. And I would argue not a very effective way to do so. And then they want to think about how do I actually use the cloud to enhance my on-prem infrastructure, to actually make it do more than it is doing today. And finally, they want to talk about once I have my workloads, how do I protect it so that there's an outage somewhere, I can be assured that I'm be able to get back up and running in a timely fashion. So I'm going to talk a bit about Rubrik Cloud data management, how we do some of the things to help customers like Acme move to the cloud, and I'm going to demo some of the capabilities that we have. So if you think about data management in the past 25 years, things actually have been, the architecture behind it hasn't changed a lot, right? If you think about how you back up your on-premises infrastructure today, it's basically one or maybe a couple of master servers that keep track of all your backups, and you have a bunch of media servers or data movers that are moving things off often to tape, and you're backing up bare metal machines as well as virtual environments. About 15 years ago, there was some innovation around the ability to back up first to disk before sending it off to tape, and then also been once able, now that you have things going to disk first, be able to dedupe that to be able to save on cost of backing up your data and storing it. And then we also started talking more about putting, moving copies of your data up to tape, where you can save it off to things like Iron Mountain to keep safe. So what Rubrik did is, when we came along and looked at the data management problem, we said, what if we could converge all those things we talked about, all the complexities of media servers and dedupe servers and replication servers and tape libraries, and converge them onto a single platform, typically running an appliance on premises or in a virtual machines in the cloud, and have it done in such a way that can scale out, so that as you're adding more Rubrik instances, you're actually adding capacity, both not only in terms of storage, but also in terms of performance. And then kind of leveraging what people are doing in the public cloud as a way to, again, extend what you're doing in your on-premises data center in terms of data storage. So particularly around AWS, we have 3 use cases that we are seeing customers use Rubrik for today. One is what we call cloud out, which is the idea, again, of using object storage, S3 specifically, and Glacier as a archiving tier, instead of using on-site tape or tape sent off to a facility like Iron Mountain. And the second use case is around what we call cloud on, or workload instantiation, which is the idea if I have my backups of all my on-prem environment in the cloud, instead of just being able to use it for recovery to your on-prem infrastructure, what if I could recover that in the cloud so that now I can leverage AWS for things like test dev and disaster recovery, and for even cloud migrations. And then the last thing is we have the ability to set up what we call cloud clusters, which are virtual instances running in AWS that allows you to back up your on your AWS workloads. So first thing I'm going to talk about and then demonstrate is cloud out, which is our data retention in the cloud capability. So probably all of you, if you're here today, you are either leveraging or thinking of leveraging S3, and S3 infrequently access, and also Glacier. So those, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but just to say that what we're seeing today with customers is they typically use a tiered approach, where they're using S3 standard for workloads that they think they might want to instantiate in the test dev or DR environment, and so they want to be able to get to that very quickly at a lower cost. And then for other backups, and particularly ones that they either will only instantiate on a maybe on a monthly basis, or only in an absolute emergency, they typically send it off to S3 IA, or infrequently access. And then for things that they will probably never have to restore from, but they need to keep around for compliance reasons for 1 year, 7 years, or even indefinite, that we have them send that off to Glacier. So the way cloud out works is basically, as we're backing up the on-prem infrastructure, we basically enable S3 as a archive tier. So instead of sending your backup images to tape, you're sending it off to S3. So I'm going to show you quickly how you can do that. So this way. So this is the Rubrik dashboard, and what you're seeing right now is that this lab environment I have is actually backing up multiple virtual machines, as well as Hyper-V environments, bare metal Linux and Windows, as well as multiple types of databases. So all those can be protected and managed using Rubrik. And then, And then the concept I want to focus on is around something called an SLA domain. So an SLA domain is essentially a way as a policy container where you can say, hey, this is how often I want to back up my environment, how long I will retain the data for, and apply that environment to a set of on-premises or cloud instances. So in this case, I'm going to walk you through how easy it is to set up a backup policy for your on-prem environment or for your AWS workloads. So if I go here, I'm going to create an SLA domain called AWS demo. And you'll see here, this is a very simple approach. All we have to do is tell it how often do I want to take my backups. So let's say I'm going to do 4 hours. Every 4 hours, I'm going to take a snapshot, a backup of my environment. And I'm going to do that for 7 days. And then once a month, I'm going to take the last known good snapshot, and I'm going to keep that around for 7 years. And by doing that, I've created a backup policy that I can now apply to any workload that I have running. And then if I go to configure remote settings, you notice that right now I have sorry. Yep, I see that. Okay. Sorry about that. 1 second. Let me see if I can get this working. Okay, let me try this again. Demo, 4 hours. Okay, you see that I have a retention period right now that says on my on-premises backup environment, I'm going to keep backups around for 7 years. But let's say I don't want to do that because that's an expensive and not very efficient approach. Let's say I want to only keep backups on site for 30 days, and I want to send the rest of my backups not to tape, but to AWS. So all I need to do is enable archiving, choose the bucket that I want to send my archives to, and then tell it how much data do I want to keep on-prem and how much I want to keep on in AWS. So in this case, I'm going to choose 66 days. So right now, using this policy, all my backups will stay on-site for 66 days. And then after that, all of it will be sent off to AWS, and it will be kept there for the remainder of the time to reach the 7-year retention period. So it's really as simple as that. And at that point, I just hit create, and now I have this policy that backs up my environment every 4 hours and sends backups monthly to AWS. And I can apply that to any machine that I'm backing up in my data center. So cancel out. And then go back here. So let me talk a little bit about some of the ways. So obviously, we're sending data to S3, but we want to help our customers be as efficient as possible with their approach to doing this. So there are some things we're doing under the covers to make that using S3 an even better proposition than just sending it off to S3 without any kind of new capabilities. So for example, one of the things we do is we actually index every single file that it gets sent out to S3 so that you can quite rapidly do a search using a Google-like interface to find any file or machine that you need that's being backed up. We can also, to make things more efficient, instead of sending full backups every single time, we actually do incrementals. And when we send those incrementals, we're also sending only incremental changes to S3. So even though you may be archiving, say, 7 years of data, you're only sending changes. You're not sending full backup images. And the intelligence also applies that you're recovering data. So today, if you need to recover even a single file from S3 that's running in a virtual machine, typically you would have to restore the entire virtual machine and then to recover that one file, which means you're incurring cost of transfer out, as well as cost of having that disk on site. In our case, we actually know the blocks that are making up the file that's sitting in S3, so we'll only pull out the blocks that you need for that specific file. So again, obviously saving you on cost in terms of a transfer fee, as well as not requiring you to have the 100% of that disk storage on site, on premises, just to recover a single file. And so the other thing we can do is if you, for high availability, we actually store the metadata for all the backups with the archive data itself as archived to S3. So in a disaster, if you lose your on-prem environment, you can actually still recover that data by setting up a new Rubrik instance that can capture the metadata and be able to recover any files that you need. So obviously, when we're talking about moving things to the cloud, security is a very important thing. All of you are probably very familiar with all the news recently about how data not being well protected in the cloud is being leaked. So we take security very seriously at Rubrik. So everything we do, both data in transit as well as data at rest, are fully encrypted. In the case of archiving out to S3, we support encryption in transit using TLS to the S3 endpoint. And then what we do is we do client-side encryption using AES 256 to encrypt the data actually on Rubrik before sending it off to AWS. So it's actually encrypted before it gets sent, and then it's encrypted as it's being sent to S3. And we use an envelope encryption where we actually encrypt the data key that's encrypting the data. We also encrypt that in what we call a key encryption key that's using RSA 2048. So it's probably the most secure approach you can take to securing data at rest. And then we also, in addition to archiving to S3, as I mentioned, we also archive data to Glacier. And once you're in Glacier, which is, again, typically what you want to do for long-term storage, particularly ones that need compliance, we also support Glacier, but natively Glacier Vault Lock, which is a way to guarantee that the data that's in Glacier is completely immutable and for compliance reasons. So we have that natively integrated into Rubrik, where you can actually set the Vault Lock onto an S3 archive that you've connected to using the Rubrik APIs. So now I want to talk about quickly talk about Cloud On. So Cloud On is this ability to say, now that I've got my backups in S3, what if I actually want to do something with it? So what we have the ability to do, for example, if let's say you have a VMware shop and you're backing up your VMware environment and we're archiving it to S3, we can actually work with AWS to convert those AWS images, VMware images on demand and convert them to armies and then launch them as EC2 instances. So you can essentially create a replica of your on-prem virtual environment and run that in AWS for DR purposes or for test dev or as a cloud migration tool. So this allows us to have multiple use cases that makes it much more flexible for our customers and also much more cost effective. And one of the use cases, for example, that our customers have is they'll, again, do a backup and restore, send it off to S3, and then in a disaster, they'll actually convert those VMware images into EC2 instances that they can then run in AWS as the DR environment. So I'm going to demonstrate how easy it is to do that in our GUI. So in this case, I'm going to go to a virtual machine that I have backed up and archived to S3. So I'll choose the machine. And you'll see that here I have a calendar that shows, so all the green dots you see are days of the week where I've done a snapshot and a backup of the environment. So I can choose any day. I'm going to choose, let's say, November 15th. And from there, I can do a number of things like recovering that virtual machine on premises, but I can also do a launch on cloud. And that point, what happens is you can tell it where the virtual machine images is. And then what we actually do is Rubrik actually examines the configuration file for that machine and makes a recommendation on what EC2 instance, what ARMY you should choose, EC2 instance you should choose size-wise that matches the CPU, the disk, and the RAM requirements for that machine. So I'm going to use whatever is recommended. I will choose. Then you can choose the VPC that this instance should be launched in, as well as the security group. And all we're doing here is we're basically talking to your AWS account to pull information about the VPCs, subnets, and also your security groups. And all I have to do is then hit submit, and I'll start creating an AMI in AWS and then launching that instance. So for the sake of time, I'm actually going to look at an instance I've already instantiated. So if I go to Cloud Mounts, you'll see that I have that same VM, that VM that I had shown you earlier. And now it's mounted on AWS, and there's an instance ID and ARMY ID associated with it. If I go to my EC2 console, let's see. You see that I have a number of machines running. So how do you know that I've actually had something that was launched? If I do a, oops, see if this works. You see here that it's picked up the instance ID that matches that machine that I had that was on the Rubrik console to show you that I've launched this instance using a VMware image that I had archived off to S3. And then from Rubrik, it's really simple for me to just be able to power off or even terminate the machine once I'm done with it. And so we can do this on an on-demand basis, but we can also actually create the armies for you and just leave them in AWS so that you can start them up anytime you want. So it's pretty flexible, and it depends on the use case that you want to use. So we'll go back here. Talk a little about how it works. So oops, okay. So essentially what we do is we basically, again, take that VMTK from the snapshot that's throwing in S3. We then upload that, we'll basically upload that to S3 as a backup image. Then we create an ARMY using the AWS import-export service. So we're just making a call to AWS saying, grab this VMTK file, convert it over to an ARMY, and then storing in your account. And then from there, we create the ARMY, and then we basically make a call using the EC2 API to launch that instance using that ARMY that was just created. So that's pretty simple, and that works for any VMTK file that you have in your environment that you're backed up and archived off to AWS. So the last thing I want to talk about is Cloud Cluster. So the idea behind Cloud Cluster was, as we talked to more customers that had migrated environments, particularly over to AWS, they were saying, how do I back up this environment? How do I protect it and not only just protect it, but use it in a way, do it in such a way that it maps to the process that I already have on premises. So one of the things I talked about in the beginning is that customers are running in hybrid environments, which means they can't just abandon the process they have, and often they want to use the same process, both on-prem and also in the cloud, in terms of backup and restore. What we decided to do was we essentially created a virtual instance of our Rubrik software, have it running encapsulated in an ARMY so that you can run it as a set of EC2 instances of EBS volumes, and you basically run it on AWS, and then it connects to your EC2 instances, and you can back up your environment using a cloud cluster. And because the software they're using is the exact same software code base that we're using for your on-prem environment, you're able to leverage a lot of the same functionality, including the ability to what we call an instant recovery of, for example, your database. So an instant recovery of database would be, we have as a example use case is We have customers today who are running SQL Server on Windows in their on-prem environment. They want to migrate that over to AWS. So once they have that running in AWS and they're backing it up, one of the things they now can do is do something. What we can do in our Rubrik cloud cluster is we can actually create a virtual clone of their database. So if they need to recover or mount a copy of that instance in order to do some kind of database check or some test dev type work, instead of having to recover the full database, we'll actually construct a virtual clone for them so that even if it's a very large database, they can actually have that back up and running in a matter of minutes instead of taking, some cases, hours to do. So I'll give you, again, this is the last demo. I'm going to show you how we do that. So I go to the Rubrik console. You see that I have a you see that I have a category for SQL Server databases. And if I'm going to go to the demo SQL 12 server. I'm just going to pick a sample database. So again, this could be a database, a SQL database that's running on a Windows VM, or that's running as part of an EC2 instance running in AWS. So what we're doing is we're backing up that SQL Server database. And you'll see I can go to the calendar, choose a day. And because we're backing up the transaction logs as well as doing snapshots of the database, you can actually do a recovery to any point in time. So let's say I'm going to recover to, okay, let's see. What? Okay, so it looks like this one, we did not do this, they did not do this. Okay, so in this one, they didn't do the transaction logs. But if we did transaction logs, you can essentially pick any point in time. And once you pick the time, you can basically do either a restore, or in this case, I'm going to do what we call a live mount. So in a live mount, I'm creating a copy of the virtual copy of the database, and then we're going to map it to a SQL Server that can then mount it as a separate database instance. So in this case, I am going to choose a SQL Server that I know I have in an environment. I'm going to pick, in this case, it's running SQL Express as the database, and I'm going to give it a name. And then when I do that, it is going to go ahead and begin mounting that database. And it should typically will only take a matter of minutes. We have customers who are doing this with terabytes-sized databases, and essentially the time it takes to mount or recover that database is the time it takes to actually launch the EC2 instance sometimes and get it up and running. So, all right. So I am going to go back to here. So let me go ahead and summarize our call to action. So you saw how we were able to use S3 or Glacier as an archiving environment. You saw that we were able to take that data, backup data, once it's in S3, and be able to use it to convert it and launch new EC2, a copy of your on-prem environment in AWS for either test dev, for cloud migrations, or for disaster recovery. And we also saw how you could use a virtual instance called a cloud cluster to be able to back up your workloads that are running actually in AWS. So if you're interested in finding out more, we have a booth in the expo hall out there. You can also go to Rubrik.com to get more information. And my colleagues and I also blog regularly and do technical white papers, kind of drilling down on exactly what is the technology behind what Rubrik. And I invite you to go to those locations to get more information. So thank you. And if you have any questions, again, you go to the booth. I'll also be hanging around if you want to talk more about Rubrik. Thank you for your time.